Welcome to CSPC 2024 pre-conference sessions. We'll start with a land acknowledgement. Hi, I'm Ramya, CSPC volunteer from Awards Committee. I'm from Toronto. I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional lands of Huron-Wendat. This is the CSPC 2024 pre-conference short talk, which will feature 5 short talks from a range of interesting subjects and accomplished speakers. Each talk will be 8 minutes of presentation, followed by 2 minutes of questions. We request you to submit your questions through Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we encourage you to upvote your preferred questions. Before we begin, CSPC will launch a demographic poll. Our first presenter is Jessica Winton. Jessica is a bachelor student at Concordia University.
Hi, so my name is Jessica Winton. The topic that I proposed was a tax on plastic. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation so everybody can see. So as we all know, plastic is surrounded by us in our everyday lives by nearly everything we touch practically. And this is a growing problem as we start to study the further effects of what plastic does to our bodies, our environment, and how it degrades. So the current problem is that plastic is made up of fossil fuels, which are a non-renewable resource, meaning we can't keep them forever. Despite this, plastic doesn't get recycled nearly as much as we would like to think. Canada overall does about 9%. So 9% of the plastic that you put in your recycling bin is what's actually recycled. And we also constantly treat plastic as disposable, but the numbers are telling us that it's really not. So why do we keep creating more and more plastic? It's because it's very useful, but should we better utilize what we send to a landfill to prevent environmental contamination and contamination of our bodies? And why don't we already? We already have a carbon tax, which has a proven track record to benefit Canadians and other countries it's been employed in, but we don't really have a way of specifically taxing plastic. Something that can persist in the environment at the top of Mount Everest and at the bottom of our ocean for thousands of years before actually ending up integrating into microplastics. So the reason why we're surrounded by plastic is because it's become a part of our daily lives and we're obsessed with disposability and convenience. So this graph by Stats Canada on the red line shows how much plastic we're diverting from landfills. The gray line, which is at the very bottom here, is what's actually being recycled. And the top blue line, which is in dark blue, is what we're producing. So there's a very, very, very significant gap in terms of how sustainable we are. So we discard nearly 80% of the plastic we actually produce. And it's starting to get worse in terms of what we recycle. Because plastic is incredibly cheap to make and use, it's used in basically everything. We're wearing plastic, plastic comes in our food, our water, everything. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Plastic has many, many, many beneficial uses, especially in places like the medical field or electronics, where they become lightweight. So it doesn't mean that we need to get rid of plastic entirely. We just need to make it in a more sustainable way. So if you were to base an idea solely on this graph, you might think that we have to get rid of plastic, but we really don't. We just have to be more mindful of how we interact with it and how we use it. Taxes on products, such as a 10-cent fee for a plastic bag when you buy things at the grocery store, may not seem like much when it only applies to grocery bags, because it's not. Many of the plastic products we create are not recyclable by design. So if we take a bag of chips, for example, there are over 6 layers of plastic to keep them fresh, which cannot easily be separated and recycled as of 2024. Plastics are useful, but obviously we need to change our design if we want to have them around going forward. So we can improve sustainability a few different ways. The first would be to change our labeling system to be in line with other countries such as France. We only have 7 categories of plastic here, and the ones that get recycled most are really just numbers 1 and 2, with the others not being recycled nearly as much. So yeah, mixing plastics is a very large problem. So when you have a product that maybe contains plastics 1, 4, and 5, the odds of that product being recycled go down to less than 1%. So I wanted to use my water bottle as an example because most of us have a water bottle and we can see it in our hands. So if we look at the cap, we can see how there's 4 metal screws, a spring, 2 O-rings, there's a flip cap, there's a handle, there's the actual plastic base and the bottle itself. So you're already well over 10 components for something that you just need to drink out of. And not all of them are recyclable. So if I wanted to recycle my bottle cap, the odds of that happening would be very little unless I disassemble it myself. So we can either look for replacements to plastic or incentivize innovation in material science and manufacturing to change what kind of plastics get disposed of. So there are 4 main factors of what causes a plastic item to be polluting: the type of plastic, the weight of the plastic, the volume of plastic, which is especially important for type 6, polystyrene, also known as styrofoam, and the number of plastic components to an object, because the more components there are, the less likely it is to be recycled. So what do we propose on this? So we're looking at a holistic tax system that would tackle the 4 aforementioned factors. So we're taxing the type of plastic, since some plastics like PET type 1 are recycled at rates above 30%, while polypropylene, which is type 5, sits at 3%. In the European Union, they have also implemented a tax on plastic by weight in Italy, which ignores how some plastics like styrofoam or polystyrene weigh less and break apart more easily, which leaves more microplastics in our environment and in our bodies. There have been studies recently showing that in 100 or I believe 99% of test subjects of human organs, they have found microplastics in our brains and a lot of other places. So these can affect our hormones and our health. Some have been linked to cancer, but no definitive proof as of yet. But obviously, we'd like to prevent that. So taxing the plastic additionally by volume ensures plastic types like polystyrene do not suddenly become overrepresented, especially because in some provinces like Quebec, polystyrene is not accepted to be recycled at all because of how difficult it is. And then by also additionally taxing the number of plastic components per product, they should become easier to recycle as manufacturers modify their designs to keep the cost down. So in the European Union, for example, when it comes to plastic water bottles, the bottle caps on them are no longer completely separated from the bottle. So that way they don't become littered and can increase the odds of being recycled more. So the tax benefits us by directing the funds directly to material science and municipalities because it tackles 2 core problems: funding the research for different materials, lessening our reliance on plastics to drive for new sustainable solutions, and municipalities, because in Canada, they only have 2 ways of generating money themselves, which is user fees like parking permits and property taxes. So a lot of municipalities don't even have the capacity to recycle at all. And they're contracted out to for-profit companies, which obviously don't really have a vested interest in being sustainable because they don't have to deal with the consequences. So credits using this new tax stream can also be given to local governments or companies who adapt towards more sustainable methods. And plastic exists in the ground for thousands of years, but ideally, if we start taxing it and being more mindful, it doesn't have to be. So what might this look like exactly? You could play around with the numbers, but a formula could resemble the following. You could tax plastic by weight at 60 cents per kilogram, which is a bit higher than Italy's. Plastic tax, we would tax the number of components per product at 1 cent per component, as well as a 5-cent flat fee when you purchase the product. So let's say you're at a grocery store and you purchase a tube of lip balm that might contain 3 components of plastic. Each of those would be taxed at 1 cent. You'd have the flat fee of 5 cents to kind of bring it to your attention, like, oh, I'm buying a plastic product. And you'd also be paying by the weight from the actual company purchasing the volume. So the end individual consumer would only be paying the flat fee of 5 cents to ease the burden on individuals and the administrative task on companies, simply ticking a box if a product contains plastic or not. Because otherwise it might spiral out of control, and raising prices by 5 to 10% on nearly everything might be too much of a burden for the average person. But it's important that we start recognizing the plastic problem yesterday. And that is all. So if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a wonderful presentation. So, speakers, if you have any questions, feel free to mute and ask her. And you can also drop the questions in Q&A chat box.
No questions, I suppose.
Okay, so we have one here. Thanks, Jessica. This is great. And what is your area of study?
I am a current undergraduate student at the Concordia University with a specialization in urban planning. So maybe I'll do a master's soon enough, but yeah. So I see another question. If we can force companies to state clearly that this product is not recyclable, we certainly can. Places like France have labels, which is one of the important factors that I brought up in terms of redefining our scheme labeling plastics. On most products, if not all products in France, there's a label that just shows you putting it directly into a trash can as opposed to recycling. And implementing that, I think, is a very, very important step, because contamination of non-recyclable items in recycling is a massive factor in determining what actually gets recycled or not.
I guess there are no other questions.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Kai Sullivan. Kai Sullivan is a postdoctoral fellow at Ghent University.
Hello. As we said, my name is Kai, and I want to thank the CSPC for the opportunity to speak today about ways to enhance early career research opportunities in Canada. Having spent the past few years away from Canada performing postdoc research in Belgium, I've been able to learn a bit about the research funding systems in the European Union and its member states. And I was inspired to submit a proposal for the CSPC Youth Award after noticing the comparative lack of early career research opportunities in Canada. So you may have seen in the news earlier this year that significant increases to research funding were announced in the 2024 federal budget. This is great news, and includes much needed increases to the number and value of national awards for graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. It may sound crazy, but the value of these awards had not increased with the cost of living since the mid-2000s approximately. So the changes in budget 2024 follow 2 federally commissioned reports in 2017, I believe, in 2023, into the funding of research in Canada and campaigns for increased research funding by advocacy groups like Support Our Science. However, despite being acknowledged in both federally commissioned reports, one critical area that remains unaddressed is how to retain the talented researchers that this new funding will produce. For example, even without these increases to funding, the number of university students and PhD graduates has climbed over the past 20 years, but the number of professors has been stagnant since 2009, leaving fewer opportunities for early career researchers to make the transition to permanent roles. So at the same time, Canada's investment in R&D has steadily dropped as a percentage of GDP, while over the same period, most G7 and OECD countries have increased R&D spending, leaving Canada significantly behind. Now, understanding how many graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and early career researchers choose to leave Canada or academia entirely is complicated because Stats Canada and individual universities don't quantify who is leaving and why. But a 2024 survey published by the Ottawa Science Policy Network found that over 1/3 of respondents who received their graduate degree in the last 10 years left Canada, and that almost 2/3 currently enrolled or are likely or very likely to leave Canada after getting their degree. So of those who already left, over 70% are still in academia, and the highest scoring factor behind their decision to leave was the lack of available opportunities or jobs. The fact that career considerations rank so highly and that over 70% of respondents who left Canada are still in academic roles abroad points to a gap in Canada's research and innovation strategy. So after getting your PhD, how do you continue your academic career in Canada? Well, you could try to find some funding from industry, maybe supplement that with a grant from MyTax. I took that approach. Or you can apply for funding from whichever national tri-agency programs are relevant to you. But you'll have to be quick to make the transition to a tenure-track faculty position after that, because your eligibility for these postdoctoral awards generally runs out after about 2 years post-PhD. And how do you generally find a faculty position in Canada? I would say that Canada is kind of traditional in this sense, as it mostly comes down to applying for an open position to fill specific research or teaching gaps in a university department. Often job descriptions for these positions are highly specific, and if you believe the gossip, in some cases are even written with a particular candidate in mind. So universities can nominate Tier 2 Canada Research Chairs. That's another avenue. These are intended for early career researchers, but typically only professors are this is typically only professors that are currently employed in a prescribed area of strategic interest that are nominated. So fortunately, Budget 2024 wasn't the only good news this year for Canadian research community. Canada recently became an associate member of Horizon Europe, the European Union's key funding program for research and innovation. You may be surprised to hear that we can join EU initiatives, but we're actually joining about 20 other non-EU associated countries in this. While promising, I think that this move doesn't go far enough, as Canada has only joined the industrially focused partnerships of Horizon's Pillar 2 and cannot benefit from the full range of funding and collaborative opportunities offered by the European Research Council, or the ERC for short. What I propose is that Canada join countries like Iceland, Norway, and the United Kingdom, who benefit from being associated to the entire Horizon Europe program. Crucially, despite not being in the EU, research institutions in associated countries can act as hosts for large research grants, such as ERC starting grants. So ERC starting grants, if you haven't heard of them, are available to researchers of any nationality with 2 to 7 years of experience since completing their PhD, and provide up to 1.5 million euros for a period of 5 years to establish a research group in Europe or an associated country. This would be a much needed additional pathway to research independence in Canada. And researchers in any field of research can apply and use this as a launching point for their independent research career, with host institutions typically offering pathways to long-term employment to attract and retain top talent. And importantly, ERC starting grants operate without predetermined research priorities, which means that it leaves room for the most creative and innovative research proposals. So on top of starting grants, there are other grants intended for more established researchers that will help them continue their research career in Canada. There are also synergy grants where a group of 2 to 4 researchers from different countries can work together on an ambitious research problem. ERC grant recipients are also eligible for proof of concept grants, which helps bridge the gap between research and early phases of commercialization, and will supplement the economic benefits sought by Canada's participation in the industrially focused partnerships of Pillar 2. I also want to say that while not the exact focus of this talk, Canadian institutions would also be able to, if we join Pillar 1, be able to serve as the primary host for Marie Curie fellowships. These are postdoctoral awards, and this is the funding that I'm currently on in Belgium. So you'd be able to hold this in Canada. So this would be great because few opportunities exist for performing research more than 2 years after getting your PhD in Canada. Finally, a crucial benefit of Canada becoming a full, or not another benefit rather, of becoming a full associated member country of Horizon Europe is the really rigorous review process and vetting of grant proposals done by top researchers from around the world, people that they enlist to review these proposals. So to sum it up, despite Canadian researchers being eligible to hold ERC grants in EU member states and associated countries, Canadian institutions currently can't serve as hosts, and this creates a one-way street through which the top research talent in Canada flows out. By joining Horizon Europe as a full associated member country, this will help boost the retention of emerging Canadian researchers, provide Canadians performing research abroad with a home for their ideas back in Canada, and attract top international talent to Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. That was wonderful. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in chat box, or you can unmute and ask speakers if you have any. Maybe we'll wait a minute or two. So we have a question. Do you think the postdocs received enough support to continue on as an academic?
No, I found that there's a really big contrast between how postdocs are funded in Canada, and if I look at uh, European countries such as Belgium or France or the Netherlands. So just in Belgium as an example, there are two tiers of postdoctoral fellowships. There's well, just in Flanders alone, actually, the northern province of Belgium, they have this junior postdoc with just 3 years of funding, and then there's a senior one for an additional 3 years of funding. That just like blows out of the water any programs that we have in Canada from the tri-agencies. And you're eligible for these, I think, like well, the junior one, maybe 3 to 4 years outside of your PhD. And then the senior one, I think you can apply for 5 years after your PhD, 5 or 6 years. And Marie Curie fellowships, I think you can apply for about 6 years after you finish your PhD. So there's no real like rush to get you on to the next stage. Like I have colleagues who've been postdocs for like 5 or 6 years at this point. There's just not many positions out there to make that jump right away.
I guess there are no more questions.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Eden Hetley. Eden Hetley is a PhD student at University of Toronto.
Thank you. So let's see, I'm just gonna sort out all my windows. Give me a second here. All right, good afternoon, everyone. As was said, my name is Eden Hatley. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and I work under the supervision of Dr. Chelsea Rockman. My research uses a transdisciplinary approach to advance our understanding of plastic pollution management in the Laurentian Great Lakes region. And today I'm presenting on my policy proposal to leverage the longstanding Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to address plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Great Lakes are the largest freshwater system on Earth and contain approximately 1/5 of the world's surface freshwater supply by volume. They hold immense socioeconomic, cultural, and ecological value About 30 million people live in the Great Lakes Basin, including approximately 10% of the US population and 30% of the Canadian population. The Great Lakes support a rich ecosystem that includes thousands of species of wildlife, some of which are found nowhere else on Earth. And the Great Lakes are the backbone for a diverse regional economy worth an estimated $6 trillion US that comprises sectors including manufacturing, agriculture, energy, transportation, and tourism and recreation, among others. But unfortunately, like other aquatic ecosystems globally, and especially freshwater systems, the Great Lakes have a plastic pollution problem. In 2017, it was estimated that nearly 10,000 tons of plastic enter the Great Lakes each year. This includes approximately 30 tons to Lake Superior, 600 tons to Lake Huron, 1,400 tons to Lake Ontario, 2,500 tons to Lake Erie, and 5,300 tons to Lake Michigan. Of course, we've come to understand since 2017 that this is likely a large underestimation, but it is the best estimate that we have to date. And we see evidence of this estimated emissions across the entire region. So this is a summary of 43 different studies published between 2011 and 2023 that measured microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes, broken down by lake as well as the matrix studied. So that includes water, sediment, shoreline, and biota. And as you can see from the figure, we've now documented the presence of microplastics in each Great Lake and across all these matrices, signifying that this problem is widespread. So the question that follows this is, what is being done to address this plastic pollution problem? Given the problem is regional in scale, I think the appropriate place to look is to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. First signed in 1972 and most recently revised in 2012, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is an agreement made between Canada and the US that outlines priorities and actions to prevent and resolve transboundary environmental issues that impact water quality in the Great Lakes. Currently, the agreement addresses plastic pollution in Annex 5, discharges from vessels, which prohibits the discharge of garbage, including plastic, from vessels in Great Lakes waters. However, research shows that an estimated 80% of plastic pollution in aquatic system originates from land-based sources, with the remaining 20% from water-based sources. So this means that the agreement currently is mitigating at best less than 1/5 of the sources of plastic pollution to the Great Lakes. I'm proposing that 2 additional annexes of the agreement, Annex 3, Chemicals of Mutual Concern, and Annex 10, Science, be used to facilitate a more comprehensive approach to addressing plastic pollution in the Great Lakes region. So I'll begin with Annex 10. Annex 10 provides a framework for coordinating and advancing regional scientific activities. And under Annex 10, Canada and the US have to report on the health of the Great Lakes ecosystem every 3 years by assessing 9 ecosystem-based indicators, which you can see listed in the figure on the right-hand side there, from drinking water all the way to watershed impacts and climate trends. The toxic chemicals indicator, which I've highlighted using a red box in the center there, synthesizes information on pollutants in the Great Lakes, including their concentrations in sediment, water, biota, and air, and then ranks them on a sliding scale from low concern to high concern based on the concentrations measured. So I propose that microplastics be included as a toxic chemicals sub-indicator. So they are a pollutant that is measured and feeds into this toxic chemicals ranking. This would necessitate that the Canadian and US governments consistently monitor and report on levels of microplastics in the Great Lakes under a harmonized monitoring program, which currently does not exist in the region. And an environmental monitoring program would be helpful in terms of management, as it would enable governments to identify sources of microplastic pollution, which then they can take this information upstream onto land and start to introduce pollution control measures. It also enables governments to track trends in pollution over space and time. Currently, the data set we have mostly comes out of academic research endeavors, and it's spotty over space and time. It's difficult to discern trends. And then last, it helps government evaluate the effectiveness of management actions. So any actions that are put in place, you can assess over the years if we actually see a reduction in the concentrations in our lakes. And then in terms of management actions, this is where Annex 3 comes into play. So Annex 3 provides a framework for identifying and managing chemicals in the Great Lakes ecosystem that originate from anthropogenic sources and that may harm human health or the environment. And this annex aims to reduce the environmental release and impact of these chemicals. And to facilitate this, Annex 3 mandates that governments compile binational strategy reports for chemicals designated as chemicals of mutual concern, detailing agreed upon risk mitigation and management options for prioritization and implementation. And these management options can range from continuing adherence to relevant international environmental agreements. And this is particularly pertinent to plastic pollution because currently an international agreement is being negotiated at the UN. And these actions can also include things like increasing public outreach and awareness on pollution prevention, to developing things like domestic environmental quality standards. So I propose that microplastics also be considered as a candidate chemical of mutual concern. Like other chemicals designated as chemicals of mutual concern, microplastics meet many of the screening criteria outlined by the governments. So microplastics have been shown to be harmful to aquatic organisms, including at levels present in the Great Lakes. They have been found in drinking water and the fillets of sport fish sourced from the Great Lakes, which suggests that the Great Lakes may be a route of exposure for humans to microplastics. The emission of microplastics to the environment is predicted to nearly double between 2019 and 2060 in Canada and the US. And many sources of microplastics to the environment remained unaddressed across Great Lakes jurisdictions. So designating microplastics as a chemical of mutual concern would help tackle some of these management gaps and encourage and mandate the governments to begin to act on plastic pollution. So leveraged together, Annexes 3 and 10 could provide the governments of Canada and the US with a mechanism to coordinate a more comprehensive approach to addressing plastic pollution in the Great Lakes that does more than just focuses on 1/5 of the sources of plastic pollution, which the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement does in its current state. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are some.
Thank you, Eden. That was a wonderful presentation. So we'll wait for a minute.
Sounds good.
I guess there are no questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Zainab Taleb. Zainab is a PhD student from University of Windsor.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Zainab. I'm from the University of Windsor, and I'm joining you from my research lab, which resides on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy, consisting of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. As part of my PhD research here, I've been able to integrate or investigate the effects of the circadian clock on gastrointestinal health. And my slide is not forward. Okay. And during this time, I became increasingly aware of the fact that time, taken as a medical parameter, is often disregarded when it comes to healthcare. This oversight can lead to suboptimal diagnoses and treatment plans. And today I'm presenting a proposal that would bring us closer to a new era in diagnostics, one where timing isn't just incidental, but integral to patient care. For a bit of background, our Earth is continually rotating around its axis, exposing us to the daily light and dark cycles that we call day and night. As a result, nearly all organisms have adapted their biology to match these rhythms in nature. These are termed circadian rhythms, which are the daily rhythms in our biological and physiological processes that fluctuate in anticipation of the 24-hour rhythms of our planet. The most common rhythm we tend to think of is our sleep-wake cycle, but this daily timing extends to a significant portion of all biological functions, such as hormone production, digestion, and immune response. In fact, nearly 40% of our genetic makeup has been shown to exhibit circadian rhythms. Just like so many other biological factors, biomarkers, which signal health status and disease, are also influenced by circadian rhythms. Let's look at one example of a biochemical marker in a routine blood test. Alanine aminotransferase, or ALT, is a liver enzyme that is often analyzed in order to tell us more about liver function. In the study, ALT levels were measured in patients with cirrhosis. Blood was drawn from 12 patients at several time points over the course of 24 hours. And in this graph, we see that the levels of ALT fluctuate in a rhythmic manner throughout the day, with decreased expression at night and the early hours of the day. In fact, the early morning samples fall within the normal range of ALT levels determined by the Medical Council of Canada and other laboratories. This demonstrates that a sample collected in the morning versus one collected later in the day can give us a different picture of a patient's health. This is only one example, but there's evidence to show that levels in immune cells and even circulating tumor cells also oscillate throughout the day. Without factoring in these natural rhythms, we risk missing early warning signs of disease, leading to delayed diagnoses and potentially less effective treatments. Fortunately, we have an opportunity to address this by implementing a straightforward yet transformative policy. This proposal consists of 4 actionable steps to integrate time of day considerations into medical diagnostics. The first and simplest step is to ensure the documentation of time of day for all patient samples. This basic piece of information provides essential context for interpreting biomarker levels. By simply noting whether a blood sample or biopsy was taken at 9 a.m. or 5 p.m., healthcare providers will have a clearer picture of what normal or abnormal results mean for that time of day. The second step involves creating a comprehensive database for biomarkers over 24 hours. Using samples from existing biobanks, we can track how disease markers change throughout the day under both normal and diseased conditions. This resource would serve as a powerful diagnostic tool, enabling clinicians to interpret results with a higher resolution based on the time of sample collection. Third, I propose incorporating probes to test for clock gene function. Clock genes regulate our circadian rhythms and influence how different body systems operate at different times of day. This insight will allow us to tailor diagnostics and treatment plans even more precisely, aligning with the patient's biological clock. Finally, we can leverage insights from this database to strategically schedule diagnostic appointments. By identifying the times when specific biomarkers reach peak levels, healthcare providers can schedule tests during those optimal windows. For instance, cancer screenings could be timed to catch fluctuations in circulating tumor cells, improving early detection. Integrating time of day considerations into diagnostics has significant potential benefits. By accounting for rhythms and diagnostic biomarkers, we can reduce the risk of misdiagnosis due to testing patients at suboptimal times of day. When diagnosis is more precise, treatment can be administered sooner, potentially reducing the need for repeated tests and helping patients access appropriate care faster. Fewer misdiagnoses and more efficient testing could also reduce costs associated with incorrect treatments, unnecessary follow-ups, and delayed interventions. Finally, this policy paves the way for a healthcare model where diagnostics and even treatments are customized to each person's biological clock, which has the potential to further improve health outcomes. Ultimately, this policy leverages a simple yet transformative insight. Time matters in diagnostics. By taking a circadian approach to medicine, we can make significant strides in improving diagnostic precision and healthcare outcomes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Zina. That was great presentation. So we'll wait for the questions. So we have a question. How would the proposed database integrate with existing medical testing protocols? And what challenges do you foresee in getting healthcare providers to adopt time-based diagnostics in routine practice?
That's a really good question. So in terms of integrating the first point in this proposal, just noting down the time of day that samples are collected, I think that's something that's very easy to integrate. Most of our systems already timestamp everything we input into it. So just creating that database to kind of funnel that information into one site is something that's really achievable, I think. In terms of scheduling patients to come in at certain times of day, that can be definitely more challenging. The patients tend to go to the doctors when they don't feel well. So telling them, oh, wait until 8 p.m. to come in might be a bit hard to convince people to do. But when it comes to screening, especially screening people who are at a higher risk of developing certain disease, for example, they might have a family history of liver disease, knowing the appropriate time to screen them in order to have the most precise diagnosis would definitely be beneficial.
Thank you. We have one more question. What do you think about challenges to upscale this technology?
So it would definitely require a database that could fit a lot of information. I don't think it's information we're not capable of storing. we're in the age of single cell RNA sequencing and really large omics analysis, and we're able to store quite a bit of information that way. But this would essentially become a time-based reference for these certain medical tests. So we already, whenever we do a blood test, they're being compared to levels that are normal or abnormal. This would just make it a more resolved and higher accuracy comparison to those data sets that already exist.
Thank you. I guess we don't have any more questions. Thank you for your time, Zina.
Thank you so much.
So our next and last speaker of the session is Scott Schrempf. Scott is a master's student at University of Waterloo.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my slide set up. Perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm Scott Schrempf, and will be presenting my CSPC proposal incorporating social sustainability and equity into Canadian fisheries management plans. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University is situated in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples. As I have the privilege of living and learning on these lands, I'm governed by the peace and friendship treaties, as we are all treaty people. For this talk, I'll first give a brief personal background, as well as my inspiration for the proposal. Then I'll outline the need and opportunity for action. Following that, I will discuss my proposed action, as well as finish with the novelty of the approach. So as mentioned, I'm a Master's of Marine Management student at Dalhousie University, which is an interdisciplinary degree focusing on incorporating social, economic, and ecological sustainability into management. I began to recognize the need for interdisciplinary approaches in my undergraduate degree at Queen's University in biology. We often learned that despite decades of scientific knowledge describing things like climate change or overexploitation of fisheries, governments internationally have failed to enact actions that promote sustainable resource use as well as conservation efforts. Largely, this is because historical management decisions have relied primarily on ecological and lesser so economic data, while failing to account for social outcomes and the people that rely on these resources the most. By incorporating social sustainability into fisheries management, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or DFO, can improve equity in the allocation of and access to fishery resources, which will serve to improve overall sustainability outcomes while spurring coastal economies. So for the need for action, marine resources have enormous potential to spur coastal and Indigenous community economies. However, overexploitation as well as mismanagement can result in social harms. For example, Atlantic ground fisheries such as Atlantic cod, Atlantic redfish, as well as halibut were once a pillar of the Eastern Canadian economy. But in 1992, the DFO closed the fishery, the cod fishery specifically, based on solely ecological data. The resulting impacts on coastal communities were devastating and still continue to this day, highlighting the need for social considerations in management. Today, the DFO uses integrated fisheries management plans, or IMFPs, to support the management of conservation of sustainable resource use in fisheries and combine science and Indigenous knowledge with industry data to determine best practices. To illustrate the need for social considerations, I'll use the Atlantic groundfish IFMP as an example. So in this IMFP, there are mentions of ecological, economic, as well as social considerations in management. However, the factors are not considered equally. The plan largely describes ecological considerations and uses these for things like modeling as well as decision making. Comparatively, economic considerations are only described through promoting an economically prosperous fishery, which is something that is quite difficult to define. And social considerations are only discussed through Indigenous food, social, and ceremonial rights without a pathway towards guaranteeing these rights for all Indigenous peoples. While the DFO knows how to determine the ecological sustainability of a fishery, they don't have indicators for, nor really know how to determine the economic or the social sustainability. Instead, they rely on consultations, which may amplify voices that are already powerful, like industry representatives, which may perpetuate inequitable access for and adverse effects on coastal and Indigenous communities. So to improve the social sustainability and equity considerations in Canada's IMFPs, I outline two parallel processes. First, I suggest a large-scale research project to determine social indicators that DFO can then use and incorporate in management plans. This could be modeled after the NOAA Fisheries Community Social Vulnerability Indicators tool, which looks to better understand coastal community vulnerabilities as well as resiliences. For example, this tool found that fisheries communities were more likely to be poor, have higher levels of minorities, higher unemployment rates, as well as lower education levels. By understanding Canada's social context, it would enhance DFO's ability to promote coastal economic development and mitigate social impacts of conservation decisions. Additionally, it could allow them to better understand and consider the social sustainability benefits of small-scale fisheries. An example for the benefits of small-scale fisheries and the need for explicit social indicators and allocation, I look to the recently reopened Atlantic redfish fishery. In determining the allocation percentages for this fishery's expanded quota, DFO allocates 21% of the quota to midshore and inshore fleets, which typically represent small-scale fisheries, and then 60% is going to large-scale industrial fleets based on public consultations that weren't released publicly. While it's unclear how these numbers were reached, members of parliament suggest that this decision is quite unfair to coastal communities and has the potential to promote unsustainable fishing. While large-scale fisheries do provide benefits to communities, there's no real requirements of where these benefits go, so who staffs their ships or where they process their catches. Clear indicators as well as public consultation processes would enhance both the social sustainability as well as trust in decision-making process. This starts with better understanding of the social landscape in Canada's coastal communities. So the second process involves removing barriers as well as legislation that impedes social equity for Indigenous peoples. In 2021, Canada passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which acknowledges inherent as well as treaty rights of Indigenous peoples and traditional stewardship practices. To advance reconciliation in its practices, DFO must work with Indigenous communities as partners to remove colonial structures from management. However, in this proposal, I am suggesting that they create explicit policies outlining how these collaborations would occur on a nation-to-nation basis. So while there's a global push towards incorporating social and economic factors into fisheries management, fish populations continue to decline due to overexploitation as decision makers largely rely on the ecological aspects of the fishery. This proposal outlines a shift towards systematic social consideration in Canada's fisheries management that will help DFO account for coastal and Indigenous community well-being as well as promote equity. Additionally, these two paths help DFO move away from consultations as the sole method of community consideration and promote economic development in coastal communities while upholding Indigenous rights. With the reopening of the Atlantic cod fishery as well as recovery of other fish populations, the time to act is now. My proposal prevents the first step towards having socially, ecologically, and economically sustainable fisheries in Canada that provide for today's Canadians while being able to plan for future needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How can the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement be expanded or adapted to effectively address the complex sources and transboundary nature of plastic pollution? And what specific actions do you propose to ensure coordinated efforts between Canada and United States?
I believe that was a question for Eden.
Oh, sorry, I misread it.
That's okay.
Sorry. So, speakers or anyone, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat box for the Scott. I guess we have a question. What specific social indicators do you propose incorporating into fisheries management plans, and how can DFO ensure that equity-based considerations are meaningfully integrated, particularly in relation to indigenous communities' self-determination?
Oh, so that's a big question. And it's not something that's uh, like there's not really any examples internationally or within Canada that already incorporate social indicators in management. So, for example, my particular area of study is the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which is an international fisheries management organization. And they're only just starting the path towards incorporating social indicators within management plans. However, it's a process that's now been going on for almost 13 years of just debating on what social indicators to include and how they represent need. Um, Particularly, though, I think social indicators highlighting dependency on the resource. So things like fish consumption per capita are typically discussed, as well as employment numbers, percentage of the local economy that is engaged with fishing activities. Those sorts of indicators represent kind of a dependence on fisheries resources, and therefore are things that you can look to adequately paint the picture of need. In terms of Indigenous community self-determination, that one is a little more, I'm a little more hesitant to answer on that. I think that these considerations are more so based on consultations directly with Indigenous communities, as well as how they kind of decide to use their resources themselves. I know in Atlantic Canada, the Marshall Decision of 1999 allows Indigenous peoples the right to fish under inherent and treaty rights. And these indicate that DFO needs to work with them to ensure that that's going well, but they have the rights to control their fisheries.
Thanks. So we'll wait for a minute to see if you have any other questions. So I guess we don't have any more questions. Thanks for your time, Scott. So we have a question for Eden and Kai. Kai, your question is, do universities support us adequately to explore non-academic paths?
Do universities do that? I guess that's on a case-by-case basis. Lots of universities do offer different workshops for exploring other like non-academic or industry, governmental careers. Others maybe not so much, but I think I would be surprised to encounter a department or a university that doesn't do this. Um, but I suppose if you're getting your PhD in something, you have a little bit of a hope that you might have an academic career following that. But um, no, that's what I think. Do you have any whoever asked that, any follow up to that? I think it's really just case by case basis.
Thanks. I guess, yes, that sounds right, maybe. And Eden, I have a question for you. How can the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement be expanded or adapted to effectively address the complex sources and transboundary nature of plastic pollution, and what specific actions do you propose to ensure coordinated efforts between Canada and United States?
Yeah, the first part of the question, I think that's exactly what I presented on. I think by expanding the use of the agreement via these two additional annexes, so Annex 3 and Annex 10, it would push action on plastic pollution to be across the entire region, coordinated between the two governments. So I think the inclusion of those two annexes is a good first step. And to the second question, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yes. Transboundary nature of plastic pollution, and what specific actions do you propose to ensure coordinated efforts between Canada and United States?
Yes, so I think the first step is monitoring. So the two governments need to take a coordinated approach to monitoring plastics across the Great Lakes. So right now, lots of the monitoring is done by academic groups, research out of universities, and different methods are used. So it's difficult to compare across studies. So it's really hard to understand spatial and temporal trends right now in plastic pollution across the Great Lakes. So the first thing I think is coordinated monitoring taken via the two governments. And then, as the question mentioned, the issue of plastic pollution is transboundary. So it knows no bounds. Plastic that is emitted from Toronto can have an impact on ecosystems near Rochester, New York. So I think taking coordinated action in terms of pollution prevention, so the sources that are being targeted for reduction, is something that the governments also need to look into. And what sources? There are many sources for plastic pollution. As Jessica mentioned, we use it almost every aspect of our everyday lives. So sources is a hard question to answer because there are so many. But of course, I think the action needs to be coordinated. So if one government is addressing one source, the other government needs to address that source as well in order for there to be any sort of effective action on plastic pollution.
Thank you. So if you have any questions please drop in the chat box for any of our speakers. I guess we don't have any more questions. So thank you for your time. Thank you so much for attending the session. I would also like to thank all the amazing speakers for the time and presentation. We encourage you to stay tuned for future pre-conference events and check the CSPC website and social media for the details. We'll be launching a short poll for the feedback. Please fill that out before exiting the session. Thank you. Have a good day.